when tech billionaire Sebastian Douglas walks into Judge Daniela Greenhill's courtroom without a lawyer to defend himself in a $100 million patent battle. She can't help but laugh out loud. After 25 years on the bench, she's crushed countless unprepared defendants. But she's never seen someone this intelligent make such an obvious mistake. Little does Judge Greenhills know Douglas's fumbling performance is hiding a devastating legal strategy. As Charge Loom Tech's elite legal team presents their seemingly airtight case of patent theft, the judge continues to mock Douglas's amateur approach with theatrical contempt. But behind his scattered papers and confused questions, a trap is being meticulously constructed, one that will shock everyone in that courtroom, especially the judge who underestimated him. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now so more people can see this incredible breakdown. And make sure you're subscribed because we're diving deep into one of the most satisfying courtroom reversals ever recorded. Let's get into it. The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence as Sebastian Douglas walked through the heavy oak doors. He was alone. Judge Daniela Greenhills looked up from her bench, her eyes scanning the space behind him for the legal team that wasn't there. Her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then settled into something resembling amusement. The clerk stood and read the caption in a clear voice. Case number 24, CV 1092, Charge Loom Tech Incorporated, Plaintiff versus Douglas Technologies and Sebastian Douglas, Defendants. The formality of the announcement made Douglas's solitary presence even more striking. "Mr. Douglas," Judge Greenhills said, her voice carrying across the packed gallery, "where is your attorney?" Douglas fumbled with an oversized folder stuffed with papers. The contents threatened to spill out at any moment. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself today." A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the courtroom. Judge Greenhills removed her reading glasses slowly, deliberately, as if she needed to see this spectacle more clearly. "You'll be representing yourself in a $100 million patent case." It wasn't a question, it was an indictment. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in her chair, and a thin smile formed on her face. "Well, this will certainly be interesting." As Douglas approached the defense table, the folder slipped from his grip. Papers exploded across the polished wood surface, and some floated to the floor. The gallery erupted, but not in gasps. They were barely suppressing their laughter. Even the court officers exchanged glances, their lips twitching. Camera phones appeared in the press section, capturing every moment of the billionaire's humiliation. Listen, if you love your mom, you need to subscribe right now, because at the end of this video, I'm revealing one secret that nobody in that courtroom understood. There's a reason Douglas is acting like a fool, and when I show you the secret strategy behind it at the end, you'll realize this man is a genius. Every fumbled paper, every confused look, every moment the judge laughed at him was setting a trap. So if you want to see the secret behind the greatest courtroom performance ever recorded, subscribe now and stay until the end. Trust me, the secret is worth it. Across the aisle, Delilah Peterson, lead counsel for the plaintiff Charge Loom Tech, leaned toward her client Camden Norman. Their satisfied smiles spoke volumes. This was going to be easier than they'd imagined. Judge Greenhills watched Douglas scramble to collect his papers, and her expression showed a mixture of disbelief and condescension. "Mr. Douglas," she said, her tone dripping with theatrical patience, "are you familiar with proper courtroom procedure?" Douglas looked up from his scattered papers, squinting as if trying to remember. I believe so, Your Honor, though I may need some guidance on the technical aspects." The technical aspects. The judge's words hung in the air like an accusation. "Mr. Douglas, this is a highly complex intellectual property case, not a small claims court. You're asking this court to believe that someone of your considerable wealth chose not to retain competent legal counsel. I felt it was important to handle this personally, Your Honor. How noble. The sarcasm was unmistakable. Scattered chuckles rippled through the gallery. And tell me, have you ever actually read the federal rules of civil procedure? Douglas appeared to consider this. His gaze drifted toward the ornate ceiling as if the answer might be written there. The pause stretched too long. Judge Greenhill's jaw tightened. Mr. Douglas, are you even paying attention? I'm sorry, Your Honor. I was just... This is not a joke, Mr. Douglas? Her voice cracked like a whip. This is a federal courtroom. If you cannot show proper respect for these proceedings, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor. I apologize. Douglas reached for his papers to organize them, but his hand caught the edge of another stack. More documents came cascading to the floor. The courtroom dissolved into barely concealed laughter once more. Peterson whispered something to Norman, who nodded with evident satisfaction. The press gallery buzzed with activity, and fingers flew across phone screens. Judge Greenhill shook her head slowly, as if witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. Counselor Peterson, please proceed with your opening statement. Let's at least have one professional in this courtroom today. As Peterson stood confidently, Douglas knelt to gather his scattered papers. His face was hidden from view, but for just a moment so brief that only someone watching very carefully might have noticed. A small smile flickered across his lips before disappearing entirely. 8 months earlier, the atmosphere inside Douglas Technologies' advanced research facility crackled with excitement. Sebastian Douglas stood in the center of his private laboratory, watching the digital readouts on the monitor with barely contained joy. The numbers were impossible, yet there they were, confirmed and verified 3 times over. His team had just achieved a breakthrough that would change everything. The revolutionary electric battery design they had been working on for 5 years had finally reached its target, 10 times the energy density of any existing battery on the market. 10 times. We did it, his head engineer Sarah Martinez whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The small team gathered around the prototype, a sleek silver cylinder no larger than a water bottle, yet capable of storing enough energy to power an electric vehicle for over 2,000 miles on a single charge. This wasn't just an innovation, it was a revolution. The entire energy sector would be transformed overnight. Electric vehicles, renewable energy storage, portable electronics. Everything would change. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. Douglas wasn't one for grand gestures, but he made sure his team knew what they had accomplished. What none of them could have predicted was that their achievement had already attracted unwanted attention. 2 weeks after the breakthrough, Camden Norman, CEO of Charge Loom Tech, reached out with what seemed like a golden opportunity. He wanted to discuss a potential partnership. His company had the manufacturing infrastructure and distribution networks that could bring Douglas's innovations to market faster than anyone else. It seemed perfect, too perfect. Douglas agreed to the facility tour, though something in Norman's tone during their phone conversation had set off quiet alarm bells. When Norman arrived with his assistant and a small delegation, Douglas made sure to keep them in the approved areas only, but Sarah Martinez, ever vigilant, noticed something odd. Norman kept drifting toward the restricted sections. He would linger near doorways marked with security warnings, his eyes constantly scanning, always looking for more than what was being shown. His assistant, a young man with nervous energy, seemed more interested in the lab's layout than in the actual partnership discussion. That evening, after Norman and his team had left, Sarah pulled up the security footage. What she found made her blood run cold. Norman's assistant had been using a concealed camera to photograph through the laboratory windows. The timestamps showed him systematically capturing images of every piece of equipment, every workstation, every diagram visible through the glass. Norman himself appeared on camera multiple times, peering into forbidden areas when he thought no one was watching. He lingered near proprietary equipment, studying it with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. The next day brought an even more disturbing discovery. During a routine security sweep, Douglas's team found 3 small surveillance devices planted in non-restricted common areas. They were sophisticated, expensive, and clearly professional grade. Someone had been collecting data, listening to conversations, gathering intelligence. The evidence was undeniable. Norman hadn't come to discuss a partnership. He had come to steal. 2 months passed. Douglas and his team worked to strengthen their security and accelerate their patent filing process. But they were too late. The news came on a Tuesday morning. Charge Loom Tech had filed a patent for an electric battery design that was nearly identical to Douglas's breakthrough. Sarah brought the patent documentation to Douglas's office, her hands shaking with rage. "This is our design," she said, spreading the papers across his desk. "Every specification, every innovation." They copied everything. Douglas's legal team moved quickly. They started drafting a response and potential counterclaims because everyone knew a lawsuit was coming. Patent litigation of this magnitude would usually mean an army of attorneys, expert witnesses, and millions in legal fees. Before they could even file anything, a process server walked into Douglas's office and set a thick envelope on his desk. Charge Loom Tech had beaten them to the courthouse. They were suing him for patent theft and demanding $100 million in damages. His attorneys expected a long, expensive fight with them leading the charge. Instead, Douglas surprised everyone with his response. "I'm representing myself," he said quietly. The room fell silent. His lawyers stared at him in disbelief. Sarah spoke first, her voice rising. "Sebastian, this is professional suicide. Norman has the best attorneys in the country. You can't do this alone." Douglas looked at each of them, his expression calm but unreadable. Sometimes the best strategy is one nobody expects. And with that, he began preparing for a battle that everyone believed he had already lost. Delilah Peterson, lead counsel for the plaintiff Charge Loom Tech, rose from her seat with the confidence of someone who had already won. Her opening statement was polished, precise, and devastatingly effective. She painted a picture of Charge Loom Tech as a company of dedicated innovators who had invested years and millions into developing cutting-edge battery technology. Her voice carried across the courtroom with practiced authority, each word carefully chosen to build her narrative. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Charge Loom Tech, the plaintiff in this case, independently developed this revolutionary battery design through rigorous research, extensive testing, and the brilliant minds of our engineering team. Mr. Douglas, the defendant, is falsely accusing my client of theft. These claims are not only baseless but offensive to the scientists who devoted their lives to this work." The courtroom screens flickered to life, displaying side-by-side technical comparisons of both battery designs. To the untrained eye, they looked remarkably similar, but Peterson was ready for that observation. She walked the court through each component, explaining how similar solutions often emerge when engineers tackle the same problems. "This is not theft, Your Honor. This is the natural convergence of scientific innovation." The presentation was impressive, professional, and thoroughly convincing. Judge Greenhills leaned forward, studying the images with clear interest. Peterson's first expert witness, Dr. Sarah Chen, took the stand with an air of academic authority. She was a respected physicist with decades of experience in energy storage technology. Her credentials were impeccable, her testimony measured and professional. "I personally reviewed Charge Loom's development process," Dr. Chen explained, her voice steady and assured. "Their research was methodical and original. The timeline shows continuous progress over 3 years, with documented breakthroughs at each stage. This was independent development, not replication." She walked through technical specifications, material choices, and design philosophy with the ease of someone who had studied the subject thoroughly. The patent timeline expert followed, a specialist in intellectual property law who confirmed the one fact that seemed to seal Douglas's fate. Charge Loom Tech filed their patent application on March 15th, he stated, pointing to the official documents displayed on screen. Mr. Douglas's filing came 6 weeks later, on April 28th. In patent law, first to file establishes priority. The implication hung heavy in the air. Douglas had been too slow. Even if his design was original, he had lost the race to the patent office. Then came the moment that seemed to crush any remaining hope. Peterson unveiled Charge Loom's functional prototype, a sleek device that she placed on the evidence table with theatrical precision. A technician connected it to a demonstration rig, and the courtroom watched as the battery powered a high-demand electric motor for an impressive duration. The display showed energy output, efficiency ratings, and performance metrics. It was real, it was working, and it was undeniably impressive. Whispers rippled through the gallery. How could this be stolen if it actually worked? Camden Norman took the stand next, and his confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. He sat straight, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression one of calm assurance. Peterson guided him through his testimony with expert precision. "Mr. Norman, can you describe your interaction with the defendant, Sebastian Douglas?" Norman's voice was smooth, almost sympathetic. "We had minimal contact. I reached out about a potential partnership. Toured his facility very briefly, and that was the extent of it. When I learned he was claiming we stole from him, I was genuinely shocked." He paused, shaking his head as if deeply hurt by the accusation. "Our teams developed this technology independently over 3 years. It's unfortunate that Mr. Douglas can't accept that great minds sometimes think alike." Peterson then introduced forensic analysis from a prestigious consulting firm that had examined both designs in detail. The expert testimony supported independent creation, pointing to subtle differences in approach and methodology. The evidence was mounting piece by piece into what appeared to be an insurmountable wall. Judge Greenhills took notes constantly, and her expression suggested she was seeing a clear winner. When Douglas's turn came for cross-examination, the disaster continued. He stood slowly, shuffling through his papers as if looking for questions he had written down but couldn't find. "Mr. Norman," he began, then paused, squinting at his notes. "You said you had minimal contact with my facility?" Norman nodded patiently, as if dealing with a confused child. Douglas asked a few more questions, but they seemed rambling and unfocused. He touched on the facility tour, the timeline, the development process, but never connected them into any coherent challenge. Judge Greenhills interrupted after several minutes of this wandering interrogation. "Mr. Douglas, do you have an actual point? Because this court's time is valuable." Douglas looked up, appearing genuinely flustered. I'm just trying to understand the sequence of events, Your Honor." He glanced down at his legal pad, then back at Norman. Then, surprisingly, he simply said, "I reserve the remainder of my questions." He sat down abruptly, leaving everyone in the courtroom confused. Peterson and Norman exchanged glances of visible relief. Their expressions said everything. They had expected a fight, but this was barely a challenge. Norman stepped down from the witness stand with the bearing of someone who had just weathered a mild inconvenience rather than a legal battle. Real quick, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Justice stories like this one reach people all over the world, and I want to see how global this community really is. Comment your city and country below. I actually read every single one, and it's amazing to see where you all are tuning in from. Now back to the story, because things are about to get very interesting. Judge Greenhills appeared fully convinced by Charge Loom's presentation. She looked at Douglas with something approaching pity now rather than contempt. As the afternoon session continued, Douglas sat at his table making notes on his legal pad. But from the gallery's perspective, they looked more like absent-minded doodles than legal strategy. The judge noticed and couldn't resist one more jab. Mr. Douglas, I hope those drawings are relevant to your defense, because right now I'm not seeing much of one. A few scattered chuckles came from the gallery. Douglas didn't respond, just kept drawing circles and lines on his pad, his expression blank and distant. The case, it seemed, was already over. 3 weeks before the trial began, Sebastian Douglas sat alone in his office at 2 a.m., surrounded by stacks of legal textbooks that rose like towers around his desk. The walls were covered with printed case precedents, statutory codes, and procedural rules, all connected by different colored strings that mapped out legal strategies like a detective's investigation board. His eyes were red from exhaustion, but his focus never wavered as he moved from one book to another, taking meticulous notes in a leather-bound journal. This was his 4th consecutive night working past midnight, and his team was growing increasingly concerned. Sarah Martinez burst into his office that night, her frustration finally boiling over. "Sebastian, is this about your ego? Because that's what it looks like from where I'm standing." She gestured at the chaos of legal materials spread across every surface. Just hire lawyers, real lawyers. People who actually know what they're doing in a courtroom. Douglas looked up from his notes, his expression calm despite her anger. He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out folder after folder of perfectly organized evidence. Security footage logs, time-stamped photographs, email metadata, technical specifications, all arranged in chronological order with sticky notes indicating their strategic importance. "Look at this," he said, spreading the materials across his desk. "This is 3 months of preparation. Every piece of evidence cross-referenced, every legal precedent studied, every possible argument mapped out." He pointed to a timeline he had created, showing Norman's theft in excruciating detail. "The system expects expensive lawyers, Sarah. They expect briefcases and legal teams and endless motions. They won't see me coming because they'll be too busy laughing." Sarah stared at the materials, her anger slowly transforming into something else. Understanding, maybe. Or perhaps fear at the magnitude of what he was attempting. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for, so hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode, because this exact pattern of corporate theft and legal revenge shows up in another tech billionaire case I'm covering soon, and the strategy Douglas uses here becomes even more important in that story. Back in the present-day courtroom after his seemingly disastrous cross-examination, Douglas stood and addressed Judge Greenhills with apparent defeat in his voice. "Your Honor, I request a 1-day recess. I need time to organize my remaining evidence." The judge looked at him with barely concealed pity. "Granted, we'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. Mr. Douglas, I strongly suggest you use this time to reconsider your approach." As the courtroom emptied, Peterson and Norman exchanged satisfied looks. They had won, and everyone knew it. That evening, Peterson and Norman celebrated their assumed victory at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. The champagne flowed freely, and Norman's confidence had transformed into outright arrogance. "He actually thought he could outsmart us," Norman said, laughing as he cut into his steak. A tech billionaire playing lawyer. Pathetic. Peterson raised her glass in agreement. I almost felt bad for him today, almost. But that cross-examination was painful to watch. They discussed their post-trial plans, already moving on from what they considered a closed case. Norman even joked about sending Douglas a sympathy card. Meanwhile, across the city, Douglas's office blazed with light deep into the night. His core team had assembled, and the atmosphere was nothing like the celebration happening at that restaurant. They were working with the intensity of surgeons preparing for a critical operation. Douglas and Sarah reviewed security footage frame by frame on multiple monitors, marking every suspicious moment with precise timestamps. They identified 17 separate instances of Norman's assistant, photographing through windows. 12 times Norman himself lingered in restricted areas, and 8 occasions where Norman touched equipment he had no authorization to access. At midnight, a quiet knock came at the office door. Evan Morgan stepped inside, looking nervous but determined. He was Charge Loom's former chief technology officer, a man who had resigned 6 months earlier under circumstances he had never publicly discussed. Douglas had reached out to him weeks ago, and after much deliberation, Morgan had agreed to this meeting. I resigned because I couldn't be part of what Norman was doing, Morgan explained, his voice heavy with regret. He showed me photographs from your facility and told me to reverse engineer your design. When I refused, when I told him it was theft, he said I didn't understand how business worked. Morgan's hands shook slightly as he spoke. I knew testifying would end my career. Norman has connections everywhere, but someone has to stop this. Douglas thanked him quietly and showed him the evidence they had compiled. Morgan's testimony would be crucial, but it was only one piece of a larger puzzle. As Morgan left to prepare for his testimony, Douglas turned his attention to the technical demonstration equipment his team had been assembling. It was a sophisticated device that would display the 2 battery designs layer by layer, showing not just similarities but identical replications down to the molecular structure, the kind of analysis that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Sarah pulled up the encrypted communications they had obtained through legal discovery. Most attorneys would have glossed over them, focusing on easier evidence, but Douglas had spent weeks working with a small team of specialists to decrypt and analyze every message, building a timeline that told the story of corporate theft in Norman's own words. Priority 1, replicate before he patents it, one message read. Another said, Douglas will never know we copied him. There were 47 separate communications, each one more damning than the last. Douglas organized them chronologically, preparing to present them in a sequence that would be impossible to refute. As dawn broke over the city, Douglas stood at his window watching the sunrise. His team had finally gone home to rest, but he remained, reviewing everything one last time. Tomorrow would change everything. The trap was set, the evidence was ready, and the performance was almost over. He had endured the mockery, played the fool, and let them think they had won. Now it was time to show them what real preparation looked like. Tomorrow, he said quietly to the empty office, everything changes. The courtroom felt different when it reconvened the next morning. Something had shifted in the air, though most people couldn't quite identify what it was. Sebastian Douglas walked to his table with a subtle change in his bearing. His movements were more deliberate, more focused. The scattered papers from yesterday were now organized in neat stacks. His expression, which had seemed confused and overwhelmed just 24 hours earlier, now showed quiet determination. Judge Greenhills noticed the change and frowned slightly, uncertain what to make of it. Your Honor, Douglas said, his voice clear and steady, I call Evan Morgan to the stand. The courtroom went silent. Delilah Peterson shot to her feet, her face flushing red. "Your Honor, this witness was not disclosed. This is a clear violation of discovery rules." Her voice carried an edge of panic that hadn't been there before. Peterson's team had been drowning in routine filings over the past 2 weeks, and Morgan's name, buried in a stack of minor procedural updates, had slipped past them entirely. Judge Greenhills turned to Douglas, ready to sustain the objection and perhaps finally hold him in contempt. But Douglas remained calm. He reached into his folder and produced a document, walking it to the bench with measured steps. "Your Honor, Mr. Morgan was properly disclosed 14 days ago, as required under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 26. Here is the filing confirmation with the court's timestamp." He handed a second copy to Peterson, who snatched it and scanned it quickly. Her face went from red to pale in seconds. Judge Greenhills examined the document, her expression darkening. "The witness was properly disclosed, Counselor Peterson. Objection overruled." She looked at Douglas with new scrutiny, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Proceed, Mr. Douglas." As Evan Morgan walked through the courtroom doors, Camden Norman's confident smile vanished. He leaned forward in his seat, gripping the edge of the table. Peterson whispered something to him urgently, but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Morgan, and the color was draining from his face. Morgan took the stand and was sworn in. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it, but his voice was steady when he spoke the oath. Douglas approached him with the bearing of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Mr. Morgan, please state your previous employment." Morgan took a breath. "I was the Chief Technology Officer at Charge Loom Tech. I held that position for 8 years until I resigned 6 months ago." A murmur rippled through the gallery. This was someone from inside Norman's own company. "Can you tell the court why you resigned?" Douglas asked. Morgan's jaw tightened. "I resigned because I was ordered to do something I couldn't ethically do. Mr. Norman told me to reverse engineer your battery design." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Greenhills banged her gavel once, restoring order, but her expression had transformed completely. The amusement was gone, replaced by intense focus. "Please continue, Mr. Morgan," Douglas said calmly. Morgan described the meeting in detail. "It was 2 days after Mr. Norman's visit to your facility. He called me into his office and showed me photographs, dozens of them, pictures of your equipment, your workspace, your prototypes. He said, and I'm quoting him exactly, 'I don't care how you do it, replicate that battery. We need to file a patent before Douglas does.'" Norman whispered urgently to Peterson, his composure completely shattered. She was writing notes frantically, trying to formulate a response, but the damage was already done. Douglas continued his questioning with precision. "What happened when you expressed concerns about this approach?" Morgan's voice grew quieter but more intense. "I told him we couldn't just steal someone else's design, that it was corporate espionage. He told me, 'This is how business works, Evan. Either you're in or you're out.'" Morgan paused, his hands gripping the edge of the witness box. "He showed me the secret photographs from your facility, close-ups of proprietary components, technical specifications visible on your screens, everything. He told me to recreate it exactly, down to the smallest detail." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing, too absorbed in the testimony to look away. "What happened when you refused?" Douglas asked. Morgan's expression hardened. "I was marginalized, excluded from meetings. My team was reassigned. Within 3 months, they made it clear I had no future at the company, so I resigned." He looked directly at Norman, who couldn't meet his eyes. "But before I left, I documented everything. Timestamps, emails, the photographs Norman showed me. I knew someday this would come to light." Douglas walked back to his table and retrieved a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Mr. Morgan's documentation, which includes the timeline of events. He handed copies to the judge and to Peterson. As you can see, the theft occurred in January. Charge Loom filed their patent in March. My filing came in April, but the design they patented wasn't theirs. It was mine, stolen during that facility visit. Judge Greenhills studied the timeline, her face grave. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted completely. What had seemed like an easy victory for Charge Loom now looked like something much darker. Reporters in the gallery were typing frantically now, their fingers flying across their phones and laptops. This wasn't just a patent dispute anymore. This was corporate espionage unfolding in real time. Peterson requested a sidebar, but Judge Greenhills denied it. We'll continue with this testimony, Counselor. Norman slumped in his chair, and for the first time since the trial began, he looked like a man who knew he was in serious trouble. Douglas returned to his table, his expression unchanged, but Sarah Martinez, sitting in the gallery, allowed herself the smallest smile. The trap had been sprung, and there was no escape. Douglas walked to the presentation equipment with the calm efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Your Honor, I'd like to present security footage from my facility, recorded on January 18th. The courtroom screens flickered to life, and suddenly everyone was watching the entrance to Douglas Technologies Research Lab. The timestamp in the corner read 2:47 p.m. Camden Norman appeared on screen, his assistant trailing behind him. At first, the footage seemed innocent enough, but then Douglas zoomed in on the assistant's hand. Notice the device partially concealed in his palm, Douglas said, his voice measured and clear. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. The assistant was holding what appeared to be a phone, but the angle was wrong. He was deliberately positioning it to photograph through windows. The footage continued, and the assistant's movements became increasingly obvious. He lingered near every window marked with red security warnings, his concealed camera angled to capture whatever was visible inside. Then the video cut to another angle, and there was Norman himself. He stood at a window clearly labeled Authorized Personnel Only, his face pressed close to the glass, studying the equipment inside with intense focus. The timestamp proved everything. This was January 18th. Charge Loom's supposed independent development timeline claimed they had been working on their design since early 2023, but this footage showed Norman stealing specifications in January 2024, just weeks before their patent filing. Your Honor, Douglas continued, I now present encrypted email communications obtained through proper legal discovery. He distributed packets to the judge and to Peterson, whose hands were shaking as she took them. The first email appeared on the courtroom screens, blown up large enough for everyone to read. It was from Norman to his engineering team, dated January 20th, just 2 days after the facility visit. The subject line read, Priority Project New Battery Design. But the content was what made the room go silent. Attached are the Douglas specifications. Priority 1, replicate before he patents it. I want weekly progress reports. Peterson shot to her feet. Your Honor, these communications are privileged. Douglas didn't even look at her. They were produced in discovery, Counselor, as required by your own client. If they were privileged, you should have claimed that months ago. Judge Greenhills examined the discovery logs and nodded. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Douglas. More emails filled the screen, each one more damaging than the last. Messages between Norman and his team discussing the Douglas specifications and matching his design exactly and reverse engineering the prototype. There were 47 emails in total, and Douglas presented them in chronological order, building a timeline that was impossible to deny. Then Douglas called Sarah Martinez to the stand. She was his head engineer, and she brought with her a technical analysis that would destroy any remaining doubt. "Ms. Martinez," Douglas asked, "did you conduct a comparison between my battery design and Charge Loom's patented design?" Sarah nodded, her professional demeanor hiding the anger beneath. "I did. I analyzed both designs at the molecular level." She pulled up a side-by-side comparison on the screens. "These aren't similar designs. They're identical. Every single component, every measurement, every material choice. The probability of two teams independently arriving at this exact configuration is less than 0.0001%. Douglas then unveiled the piece of evidence he had been saving. It was an electronic device his team had built specifically for this demonstration. He activated it, and a holographic display appeared above the evidence table, showing both battery designs layer by layer. The courtroom watched in fascination as the display rotated, peeling back each component to show the internal structure. Every layer matched perfectly. Every innovation Douglas had created was replicated in Charge Loom's design. But then Douglas pointed to something crucial. "Notice this inefficiency in the cooling system," he said, highlighting a specific area. "This was a mistake in my original prototype. I corrected it before filing my patent. But Charge Loom's design includes this exact same mistake." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "They even copied my mistakes. That's proof they didn't develop this independently. They copied my prototype exactly, flaws and all, because they were working from stolen photographs, not from their own research." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Greenhills banged her gavel, but even she looked shaken by what she was seeing. Peterson stood again, her composure completely gone. "Your Honor, I request an emergency recess to consult with my client." Her voice was desperate now, and everyone could hear it. Judge Greenhills looked at her with an expression that might have been pity under different circumstances. "Request denied, Counselor. We're continuing." She turned to Douglas. "Proceed, Mr. Douglas." Camden Norman had gone from pale to flushed. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. He loosened his tie with trembling fingers, his eyes darting between the screens and Peterson, looking for some escape that didn't exist. Peterson tried to whisper to him, but he wasn't listening. He was watching his entire empire collapse in real time. The gallery was buzzing now, reporters typing frantically and photographers capturing every moment. This wasn't just a reversal, it was a complete demolition. Every piece of evidence Douglas presented built on the last, creating a mountain of proof that was impossible to ignore or explain away. The fumbling, confused billionaire from yesterday had transformed into a legal strategist who had orchestrated this exposure with surgical precision. Douglas returned to his table and organized his notes, his expression unchanged. But everyone in that courtroom knew what had just happened. The trap had not just been sprung, it had completely closed, and there was no way out. Douglas stood and addressed the court with a confidence that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "Your Honor, I'd like to invoke Section 52 SRE of the Technology Protection and Innovation Act." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm requesting a 5-year development prohibition order against Charge Loom Tech, preventing them from developing, manufacturing, or profiting from any battery technology similar to my stolen design." The courtroom went dead silent. Even Judge Greenhills, who had seen thousands of cases in her 25 years on the bench, looked momentarily stunned. "Mr. Douglas," she said slowly, removing her glasses, "I'll admit I'm not familiar with that particular provision. Can you explain its application?" There was no mockery in her voice now, only serious attention. Douglas opened one of his folders and produced a highlighted copy of the statute. Your Honor, this provision was added to federal law in 2019 specifically to address corporate espionage in technology sectors. It allows courts to impose industry-wide development bans when theft of intellectual property is proven beyond reasonable doubt. The purpose is not just to punish the theft, but to ensure the thief cannot profit from stolen innovation for a substantial period. Delilah Peterson was on her feet instantly, her voice rising in panic. Your Honor, this would destroy our entire energy division. Charge Loom has invested hundreds of millions in battery technology. A 5-year ban would bankrupt us. Douglas turned to her calmly. Perhaps your client should have considered that before stealing my work. Judge Greenhills held up her hand for silence. I'll need to review this statute carefully, Mr. Douglas. This is an extraordinary remedy. Douglas nodded. I understand, Your Honor. That's why I've prepared a legal memorandum with supporting case law. There are 3 prior applications of this statute, all successful when corporate espionage was proven. He handed the memorandum to the judge, and she began reading it immediately. As she did, Douglas continued, Additionally, Your Honor, I must point out that Mr. Norman's actions don't just violate civil law. They constitute criminal industrial espionage under Title 18, Section 1832 of the United States Code. The security footage, the encrypted communications, and Mr. Morgan's testimony provide clear evidence of intentional theft of trade secrets. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Criminal charges meant this wasn't just about money anymore. Norman could face prison time. Douglas wasn't finished. I also have evidence that Mr. Norman attempted to intimidate Mr. Morgan after his resignation. He presented a series of text messages and emails to the court. The messages were threatening, barely veiled warnings about what would happen to Morgan's career if he spoke to anyone about what he knew. These messages constitute witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Mr. Norman knew this case was coming, and he tried to silence the one person who could expose his theft. Peterson was frantically writing notes, trying to formulate some kind of response, but the momentum was completely against her now. Douglas then made an unexpected move. Your Honor, I'd like to recall Dr. Sarah Chen for cross-examination. The expert witness who had testified so confidently about Charge Loom's independent development looked surprised as she returned to the stand. She had assumed her role was finished. Douglas approached her with a stack of documents. Dr. Chen, you testified yesterday that you personally reviewed Charge Loom's development process. Is that correct? She nodded, though less confidently than before. Yes, that's correct. And you stated that their research was methodical and original over a 3-year period, Douglas asked. Again, she nodded. Douglas then showed her a document. This is your consulting contract with Charge Loom Tech. Can you tell the court when you were hired? Dr. Chen's face went pale as she read the date. I was hired 5 weeks before this trial. Her voice was barely audible. Douglas pressed on. So when you testified that you personally reviewed their 3-year development process, that wasn't entirely accurate, was it? She shifted uncomfortably. I reviewed the documentation they provided about their development process. But you never personally witnessed any of this development, did you? Douglas asked. You were hired weeks before trial to review documents and provide an expert opinion based solely on what Mr. Norman's team told you. Dr. Chen looked at Judge Greenhills helplessly. That's standard practice for expert witnesses. Douglas nodded. Perhaps, but it's very different from claiming you personally reviewed a 3-year development process that you never actually witnessed. He thanked her and let her step down. The damage was done. Her credibility was destroyed. Camden Norman was passing notes to Peterson frantically now, his handwriting becoming less legible with each message. Peterson was trying to mount some kind of defense, objecting to various pieces of evidence, but Judge Greenhills was overruling her at every turn. The judge's face had gone from amused to grave. She was taking extensive notes, and her expression suggested she was seeing a pattern of deception that went far deeper than a simple patent dispute. Douglas presented one final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, I commissioned a forensic analysis of Charge Loom's patent filing documents." He displayed the analysis on the courtroom screens. This analysis examined the metadata embedded in their electronic filing. The metadata reveals that key sections of their patent application were modified after my facility visit in January, and then backdated to appear as if they were created months earlier. The technical expert who had conducted the analysis explained how digital files contain hidden information about when they were created, edited, and modified. Charge Loom's documents had been altered after they stole Douglas's design, then manipulated to create a false timeline. The evidence was complete. Every angle covered, every lie exposed, every attempt at deception unraveled. Judge Greenhill sat back in her chair, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked at Douglas not with contempt or amusement, but with something approaching respect. The fumbling billionaire had been a performance, and she had fallen for it completely. Now she was witnessing the result of meticulous preparation, strategic brilliance, and weeks of legal research that rivaled the work of the most elite litigators in the country. Douglas returned to his table and sat down, his case complete. Douglas stood and spoke with quiet authority that silenced the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'd like to recall Camden Norman to the stand for cross-examination." Norman's face went rigid. He looked at Peterson, who seemed about to object, but couldn't find grounds. Norman slowly rose and walked back to the witness stand, his earlier confidence replaced by visible tension. As he sat down, Douglas approached with a tablet in his hand, and something in his expression made Norman grip the armrests of his chair. "Mr. Norman," Douglas began, his voice calm and measured, "you testified earlier that you had minimal contact with my company and that your design was developed independently. Is that still your testimony?" Norman cleared his throat. "Yes, that's correct." Douglas nodded slowly, then activated the tablet. The courtroom screens lit up with an encrypted message. The header showed it was from Norman's personal encrypted messaging account, dated January 19th, the day after his facility visit. The message read, "Found their weak point. Reverse engineer ASAP. This is the breakthrough we need." The color drained from Norman's face so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a plug. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Mr. Norman," Douglas said, "is this your message?" Norman's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Where did you get that?" Douglas remained perfectly calm. "Through a legal subpoena of your company's communication systems, as allowed under discovery rules. Now, is this your message?" Norman's hands trembled. "Those communications were supposed to be encrypted, private." "They were encrypted," Douglas confirmed, "until I hired specialists to decrypt them legally. Answer the question, Mr. Norman. Is this your message?" Norman looked desperately at Peterson, but she was staring at her own copy of the message, her face pale. "Yes," Norman finally admitted, "but you're taking it out of context." Douglas nodded as if he had expected that response. "Let's provide more context then." Another message appeared on screen, this one dated January 20th. It was sent to Charge Loom's board of directors. "We have the Douglas specifications. Moving forward with replication. Douglas will never know we copied him. Patent filing scheduled for March." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Greenhills banged her gavel once, and silence fell immediately. Norman's face had gone from pale to flushed, and sweat was visible on his forehead. "Mr. Norman," Douglas continued, "does this message provide sufficient context?" Norman tried to gather himself. Those words don't mean what you think they mean. We were discussing general industry practices, not specific theft." Douglas showed no reaction to the obvious lie. Instead, he displayed another message. "File a patent before he realizes what we've done. Speed is everything here." Norman attempted to speak, but Douglas cut him off by displaying message after message. "Mr. Norman, I have 47 separate encrypted communications from you discussing this theft. Would you like me to read all of them, or would you prefer to tell the truth?" Norman's confident facade was crumbling completely now. His voice rose in desperation. "You're twisting everything. You're making it sound worse than it was." Douglas remained devastatingly calm. "Am I? Let's see." He displayed a message from February 2nd. "The engineering team confirms successful replication of Douglas battery design. 98% match achieved. He'll never prove we stole it." Peterson finally attempted to intervene. "Objection, Your Honor. This is harassment of the witness." Judge Greenhills didn't even look at her. "Overruled. I want to hear this." Her voice was cold now, all pretense of humor gone. She was watching Norman with the expression of someone who had been deceived and was now seeing the truth for the first time. Douglas continued his methodical destruction. He presented messages showing Norman ordering his team to match Douglas's design exactly. Communications about hiding the theft, discussions about backdating documents, and explicit instructions to file the patent quickly before Douglas could protect his own work. Each message was more damning than the last, and each one directly contradicted something Norman had testified to under oath. Perjury wasn't just implied anymore, it was proven beyond any doubt. Norman's earlier testimony about minimal contact, independent development, and parallel innovation were all exposed as calculated lies. The security footage, Evan Morgan's testimony, the encrypted emails, and now these personal messages created a perfect trail of evidence that left no room for doubt or alternative explanation. Norman's desperation became visible to everyone in the courtroom. "He's twisting everything," he shouted, his voice cracking, "taking private messages and making them sound like crimes." Douglas stopped and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Norman, these are your own words, in your own messages, sent from your personal account. I haven't twisted anything. I've simply shown the court what you actually said and did." The simplicity of the statement made it even more devastating. Judge Greenhills leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Norman, I'm going to give you an opportunity I rarely extend. I suggest you and your counsel discuss a settlement before this proceeds further." It was clear from her tone that she was trying to spare him additional humiliation, but Norman's arrogance wouldn't allow him to accept defeat. "A settlement," he said, his voice rising. "You want me to settle when he's the one making false accusations?" He turned to Douglas. "Fine, name your price. What's it going to take to make this go away?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. Every eye turned to Douglas, waiting for his response. He looked at Norman with an expression that was neither angry nor triumphant. It was simply resolved. "Mr. Norman," he said quietly, "this isn't about money. It never was. This is about justice. This is about proving that you can't steal someone's work, lie about it under oath, and expect to walk away because you're wealthy and connected." He paused, letting the words sink in. Some things can't be bought. The silence in the courtroom was complete. Norman slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Peterson sat motionless, her expensive pen frozen above her notepad. The reporters in the gallery had stopped typing, too absorbed in the moment to document it. Judge Greenhill sat back in her chair, her face unreadable but her eyes showing something that might have been respect for the man she had mocked just 2 days earlier. Douglas returned to his table and sat down. His expression remained unchanged, but everyone in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed something remarkable. The trap hadn't just closed, it had locked completely, and there was no escape. Judge Daniela Greenhills sat at her bench in silence for a long moment, her hands folded in front of her. The courtroom was completely still, everyone waiting for her to speak. She looked visibly shaken, and those who had watched her preside for years had never seen this expression on her face before. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured but heavy, with the weight of what she had witnessed. "In 25 years on this bench," she began, "I have presided over thousands of cases, patent disputes, corporate litigation, complex intellectual property matters, but I have rarely, if ever, witnessed such clear-cut corporate theft as what has been presented in this courtroom." She looked directly at Camden Norman, who couldn't meet her eyes. "The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Security footage, encrypted communications, witness testimony from your own former chief technology officer, forensic analysis of your patent documents, and your own words under oath, later proven to be lies." She paused, letting each word land with its full weight. "Mr. Norman, you didn't just steal Mr. Douglas's intellectual property. You orchestrated a systematic campaign of corporate espionage, then committed perjury in this courtroom in an attempt to profit from that theft." Judge Greenhill straightened the papers in front of her and began reading her ruling. "The court finds in favor of the defendant, Sebastian Douglas and Douglas Technologies, on all claims brought by the plaintiff, Charge Loom Tech Incorporated." Norman's head dropped into his hands. Peterson sat frozen, her pen still in her grip but motionless. "The court further finds in favor of Mr. Douglas on his counterclaims for theft of trade secrets and corporate espionage." She paused to let that sink in. "Charge Loom Tech's patent is hereby invalidated immediately and permanently. Furthermore," the judge continued, "pursuant to Section 52C of the Technology Protection and Innovation Act, this court imposes a 5-year prohibition preventing Charge Loom Tech from developing, manufacturing, or selling any battery technology substantially similar to Mr. Douglas's design." The gallery erupted in whispers, but Judge Greenhill's wasn't finished. "The court awards damages to Mr. Douglas in the amount of $100 million, the full amount of the original claim brought against him, representing the economic harm caused by this theft and the attempted destruction of his company's reputation." She looked at Norman again, her expression hard. "Additionally, this court is issuing a criminal referral to the United States Attorney's Office for prosecution of industrial espionage under Title 18, Section 1832 of the United States Code. The evidence presented suggests clear violations of federal law." Norman's face had gone completely pale. Criminal charges meant potential prison time, not just financial penalties. This court also finds evidence of perjury committed by Mr. Norman during his testimony, as well as witness tampering in his attempts to intimidate Mr. Evan Morgan. Additional civil penalties will be imposed for these violations, and these matters will also be referred to the appropriate authorities. Judge Greenhill set down her papers and removed her glasses. What came next shocked everyone in the courtroom more than any ruling could have. "Before I close these proceedings," she said, her voice softer now, "there is something I must address." She looked directly at Sebastian Douglas. "Mr. Douglas, I owe you an apology." The courtroom froze. In 25 years of presiding, Judge Daniela Greenhills had never apologized to anyone from her bench. It simply wasn't done. Judges maintained authority through distance and impartiality, but here she was, in front of a packed gallery and rolling cameras, preparing to do exactly that. "When you walked into my courtroom 2 days ago," she continued, and her voice carried the weight of genuine remorse, "I allowed prejudice and assumptions to cloud my judgment. I saw a wealthy man representing himself, and I assumed incompetence. I assumed arrogance. I mocked you publicly, made jokes at your expense, and treated you with contempt." Her voice cracked slightly, and several people in the gallery leaned forward, hardly believing what they were hearing. "You demonstrated legal acumen that would credit any attorney in this country. You conducted yourself with patience and strategy while I ridiculed you. My conduct was unprofessional, and I am deeply sorry." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Reporters had stopped typing. Camera operators had stopped filming, too stunned by what they were witnessing to remember their jobs. A federal judge was publicly admitting her failure, showing genuine humiliation before everyone who had watched her mock this man. Douglas stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried no triumph or vindication, only grace. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "we all make judgments based on what we see. What matters is having the integrity to recognize when we're wrong. I appreciate your apology, and I respect the courage it took to offer it." Judge Greenhills nodded, visibly moved by his response. She banged her gavel once. "This court is adjourned." As she stood to leave, she paused and looked at Douglas one more time. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended the trial itself. Then she turned and walked through the door behind her bench, leaving the courtroom to erupt in chaos. Camden Norman remained slumped in his chair, his face still buried in his hands. His career was destroyed, his company facing bankruptcy, and federal criminal charges awaited him. Everything he had built through deception and theft had collapsed in a matter of hours. Delilah Peterson gathered her materials in stunned silence, already mentally preparing for the fallout that would consume her firm for months to come. The reporters rushed to file their stories, their fingers flying across phones and laptops. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a complete reversal that would be studied in law schools and business ethics classes for years to come. 3 months passed. The legal world was still buzzing about the case when Judge Daniela Greenhills made an announcement that surprised everyone who knew her. She was retiring from the bench, effective immediately. At 65 years old, after 25 years of service, she had reached the point where most judges began to consider their legacy. But something about the Douglas case had changed her. Those close to her noticed it immediately. The cynicism that had defined her later years had been replaced by something different. Reflection, perhaps, or maybe redemption. She requested a private meeting with Sebastian Douglas at his office. When she arrived, he greeted her warmly and led her to a quiet conference room. They sat across from each other, and for the first time, they spoke not as judge and defendant, but as two people who understood each other. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice quiet. "Something I've never told anyone in the legal profession." She took a breath. "Before I became a lawyer, I was an engineer. Back in the 1990s, I designed a revolutionary water filtration system. I was young, excited, naive." She looked out the window, her eyes distant with memory. "A larger firm came to discuss partnership. They toured my lab, took notes, and asked questions. 2 months later, they filed a patent for my exact design." The pain in her voice was still fresh, despite the decades that had passed. "I couldn't afford proper legal representation. I was a single woman in my 20s with student loans and no resources. I lost everything, my design, my company, my dream." She turned back to Douglas. "That's when I went to law school. I told myself I'd become a judge so I could protect people like me. But somewhere along the way, I became cynical. I started seeing procedure as more important than justice. I forgot why I started this journey in the first place. Douglas listened in silence, understanding now why his case had affected her so deeply. "You reminded me why justice matters more than procedure," she said. "Why does someone fighting alone deserve respect, not mockery? You did what I never could, and you did it with grace I never had." There was a long pause before Douglas spoke. "I'd like to offer you a position with my company, Chief Legal Counsel. I need someone who understands both innovation and humility, someone who knows what it means to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." Judge Greenhills looked at him in surprise. "You want to hire the judge who humiliated you?" Douglas smiled slightly. "I want to hire the person who had the courage to admit when she was wrong. That's rare and it's valuable." She accepted without hesitation. A week later, she symbolically removed her judicial robes for the last time and joined Douglas Technologies. It felt like coming home to the person she had been before cynicism had hardened her heart. Camden Norman faced federal criminal charges for industrial espionage under Title 18, Section 1832 of the United States Code, along with separate perjury charges. His trial was set for the following year, but his empire had already crumbled. Charge Loomtech filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to survive without their stolen battery technology and facing massive legal judgments. Norman's name became synonymous with corporate theft and arrogance, a cautionary tale taught in business schools worldwide. Evan Morgan found vindication in ways he never expected. Douglas offered him a position as ethics director, tasked with ensuring the company's innovations were protected and developed with integrity. Morgan accepted gratefully, finally able to rebuild his career after doing the right thing. His testimony had taken courage, and Douglas made sure that courage was rewarded. On a quiet evening months after the trial ended, Sebastian Douglas stood in his laboratory surrounded by his team. The battery design that had been stolen, fought over, and ultimately protected was already outdated. His team had developed something even more revolutionary, pushing energy density to levels that seemed impossible just a year earlier. As he watched his engineers work with the same excitement that had defined his own early career, Douglas reflected on everything that had happened. "True innovation cannot be stolen," he said quietly to Sarah Martinez, who stood beside him. "It can be copied, replicated, even counterfeited, but genuine brilliance, the kind that pushes humanity forward, that must be earned through integrity, persistence, and honest work. No amount of theft can create that." Sarah nodded, understanding. They had won more than a legal case. They had proven that principle mattered, that justice could prevail, and that sometimes the best strategy was simply the truth, delivered with patience and precision. The battle had been worth fighting, and the victory was more than financial. It was a validation of everything they had worked to build. Click the video on your right to see the 3 other corporate espionage cases where self-representation destroyed billion-dollar companies, the legal loopholes they exploited, and the one statute that changes everything. You'll see the patterns these strategists use, the mistakes their opponents make, and the exact moment when the trap closes.